Taoism is the view put forward by Lao Tzu in the 6th century BC. He was a contemporary of the Buddha and of Confucius. He developed an entirely different system of thought based on a different set of values. It is said that he was a wise man who eventually, when he got to be in his 60s, decided to go into retirement and rode off away from the village where he had been known, and people begged him before he left to write down his wisdom. And so the story goes that that's when he wrote down the Tao Te Ching, and then he went off to retirement, and here you see an image of him going off to retirement, having just written the Tao Te Ching. The Tao Te Ching is a work that literally means way, virtue, classic. The Tao, the way, the path. Day is virtue, and then Jing is just classic. So the Tao Te Ching is basically a treatment of two central concepts. One is the Tao, and the other is Day, this idea of virtue. So let's start with the Tao. What is the Tao? Remember, this term is used in Confucius. There it means the way, the path, the right way to live, proper ethical living. Here it means something much more metaphysical. The Tao is the one, the underlying unity, something like Brahman in Hinduism. It's the way the universe works. So it's not just an undifferentiated background thing. It is itself something that has a character, that has a dynamism. It has a sort of set of laws or processes built into it. It is what underlies what Taoists call the 10,000 things. That is to say, the everyday world. You, I, tables, chairs, bars, buses, houses, all of that is the 10,000 things, okay? The ordinary things of existence. What is the Tao really? Well, it's held to be ineffable. That is to say, it cannot really be described. It cannot be defined. And so the Tao is this underlying unity. You might think of it as something like the Force in the Star Wars movies. It is natural. It is spontaneous. It is eternal. It is unmovable. It also lacks a moral dimension. So it's the way the universe proceeds, but there is no underlying assumption here that the universe is set up to harmonize with human life and human desires. And so this is something that is really proceeding on its own path. If we've seen that Hinduism ultimately has the view that we can get what we want, that our deepest desires are in harmony with the universe, and Buddhism, that we can't ultimately get what we want within this life, that the basic structure of the universe conflicts with our deepest desires, Taoism says the universe is not interested in our desires. It neither harmonizes with it nor necessarily conflicts with it. It's doing its own thing, and it has no interest in us as such. So let's look at the very beginning of the Tao Te Ching, communicating this idea that the Tao is ineffable, that it cannot be defined. The Tao that can be trodden. Remember, this means path. So the path that can be trodden is not the eternal Tao, not the eternal path. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. Nameless, it's the origin of heaven and earth. Named, it is the mother of 10,000 things. So the Tao, if we choose to give it a name, we can call it the Tao. It is the mother of the 10,000 things. It's the process, the unity that underlies all of the ordinary things of our existence. But really, it doesn't have a name. Really, it's nameless. It is in some sense the origin of heaven and earth. It is the thing that lies in the background of the universe. It is amoral. It has no interest in us as such. Heaven and earth are not benevolent. And the term here is Ren. They treat the 10,000 things like straw dogs. The sage is not benevolent. He treats the people like straw dogs. So the universe has no interest in us. It treats us as if we were essentially disposable. And the same thing is true of the sage, the philosopher. Does the philosopher seek to make other people wise? Seek to serve humanity? No. Treats humanity like straw dogs. In other words, treats people as disposable. The Taoist sage is not a very nice guy. Okay, and why? Why? Because he's interested in imparting this wisdom that the universe in the end doesn't really care about. It's not about you, it's doing something else. You can adapt to that. The sage will have advice about how to live if this is true. But on the other hand, the sage has no interest in babying you or protecting you from the underlying truth, which is that the universe is just foreign to your interests and desires. There was something indefinite existing before heaven and earth, still, formless, alone, unchanging, reaching everywhere without becoming exhausted. It may be called the mother of 10,000 things. I don't know its name. I call it Tao. If pressed, I call it great. Great, it flows constantly. Flowing, it goes far away it returns. So the Tao is this thing that's doing what it does. If you say, I don't understand, what does the Tao do? All I can say is, well, it's doing it now. Okay, the universe is proceeding as it does. The Tao is doing what it does. It is underlying the 10,000 things. It reaches everywhere. It does not become exhausted. It is the underlying unity and the underlying process. Therefore, Tao is great. Heaven is great. Earth is great. The king is also great. In the universe, 4 are great, and the king is one of them. Humans take their law from the earth. Earth takes its law from heaven. Heaven takes its law from Tao. Tao takes its law from what it is. So there are particular things that have laws that they obey. We take our laws in part from our leaders and in part from the way the earth is. And so there are laws about speed limits, for example, that are established by our rulers. But there are other laws about, for example, not drinking or eating poison that are really established by nature. Then there are things that, well, are matters of physical law. Where do those physical laws come from? They're really part of the underlying structure of the universe. And what establishes that structure? It just is what it is. The universe does what it does. Tao takes its law from what it is. There's a contrast in the Tao Te Ching between Tao and De. Between the Tao, the way the universe works roughly, and then De, the power or force or virtue or nature of an individual thing. So Tao is something that underlies the whole universe. But you and I, and the chair and the table and the computer and the automobile, we all have De. We all have a particular virtue, a particular nature. Now, when I say virtue and nature together, you might think, that's strange. I don't understand what you're talking about. There is a twofold nature to De. It is in part descriptive. It is in part telling us the nature of the thing. But also the nature of the thing specifies what its virtue is. And so we can think of some examples here. What is a good apple?
Crisp apple.
Yeah, I mean, it's good to eat, right? It's nice and tasty, it's juicy, it's firm, what's a bad apple? Yeah, rotten, for example, wormy. So it's very easy to tell what a good apple is and what a bad apple is. What determines that? Well, the nature of the apple. Think about a cell phone. What would be a bad cell phone? One that doesn't work, right? Or one that you try to put in a number and it dials some other number. At one point, actually, I had a phone that did that. The 5 started registering as a 3. So anytime I tried to dial a number with a 5 in it, I got a wrong number. And it was very frustrating. Even more so to the poor person I kept trying to call. For about the 3rd time it happened, this elderly woman I kept getting and disturbing. I said, will you stop calling this number? But I'm sorry, I was really trying. And it took me a while to realize what was going wrong. That was a bad cell phone. What's a good cell phone? Well, one that works, right? And that actually calls people, that calls the correct person, that gives you other kinds of information and does what it's supposed to do. How do you know what it's supposed to do? Because you know its nature. You understand what it does. And so there's a connection between the nature of the thing and then what it is to be a good example of that particular thing. To put it in Aristotle's language, it's something like this. The underlying nature or essence determines the function of the thing, and the function determines what it is to be a good one or a bad. It determines its virtue. And so De is a term that applies to all of that. The nature, the function, the virtue, all of those are connected according to Taoism. They're not independent things. To talk about what a thing is and to talk about what it is to be good as one of those things, those are determined by the same thing. Now, where does the De, the individual virtue of something, come from? It comes from the Tao. So the underlying unity is what establishes all of it. Yeah?
In that case, if the De is a proper consequence of the Tao, how can the De have any kind of moral meaning? How can the De refer to things that are good or bad?
Ooh,
it's
good.
ultimately coming from the Tao.
Yeah, if the underlying Tao is something that has no interest in us, it's just treating us as straw dogs, then how can there be any moral content to the De? How can there be any normativity to this virtue as well as just nature and function? Well, think about an apple. I mean, it's a bad apple, it's not an immoral apple. The apple falls on the ground, it rots, and do you go over and say, bad, evil apple? What a terrible apple. Oh. Right? No. I mean, it is a bad apple. It's not doing what it's supposed to do, what its nature intends it to do. But on the other hand, it's not a moral failing of it, right? So the norm here is not necessarily a moral norm. It's something that means this thing is not living up to its nature. And yet it's not something that we say is really a moral failing. And the same thing we'll see is true of human beings. Human beings have something that is what they are supposed to be. But if we fail to be that, it's not exactly a moral failing. It's some other kind of failing. And so we'll have to look at the details here to see what that amounts to. But I think you're right to worry that out of this we're not really going to get moral norms. We're going to get some other kind of norm. The kind of norm that applies to a cell phone or to an apple. It happens, well, to be an apple phone. Gosh, two birds, one stone. But anyway, this is something that actually you could say is not specifically moral. And when we get to human beings, either that's going to change or what we'll understand as human virtue will turn out not to be really a moral concept either. Well, what exactly is this going to look like? Here is another way of putting this twofold character of day. Nature, function, virtue. There I've actually made it sound threefold, but really the idea is that it has a nature, and that determines ultimately what makes a good one. It has an active nature. It determines what the thing is and does, but then it also establishes what some scholars of Taoism have referred to as a regulating principle. It determines what the thing ought to be and do. To understand what an apple is to understand what it is for something to be a good apple or a bad apple. To understand what beer is to understand what a good beer is and what a bad beer is. To understand a cell phone is to understand in part what a good cell phone does and what a bad cell phone would do or fail to do. And then similarly with a human being, you might say understanding our nature will tell us what we ought to be and what we ought to do. So, the Tao produces 10,000 things and day nourishes them. Their natures give them form and circumstances complete them. The 10,000 things respect Tao and exalt day, not by decree, but spontaneously. That is to say, these are things that do not have to be established by some sort of rule. You don't have to say, okay, we now vote on the question of whether apples should be tasty. All in favor? It's not established that way, right? It is something established by the nature of the universe. And the same will be true of day with respect to other kinds of things. So, Tao produces, day nourishes, grows, nurtures, matures, maintains, and covers. It produces without claiming possession, supports without vaunting itself, matures without controlling. This is called the dark day. The dark day, the dark virtue, because it is something that is not really there on the surface. It is not trumpeted, it's not advertised. It's something that is just there in the background. To understand what this thing is and does is to understand what it would be for that to do it well. And that's something that is lying there in its nature. It is not something imposed on it on the surface. It's something hidden, in a sense, behind. If we understand its nature, we'll understand it. There is an important ethical idea that lies behind this twofold nature of day. This idea that the nature determines the function which determines the excellence of the thing. And it is this: things naturally tend toward what they ought to be and do. Apples naturally tend to become good apples. Of course, if left on the tree too long, if they fall on the ground and get eaten by bacteria or worms or something, they become bad apples. But they naturally tend to become good. And there might be something, an apple, let's say, that never gets to that stage, but it's in some sense defective. The same thing true of cell phones. Cell phones are supposed to actually function in a certain way, and if they don't, they're defective cell phones. So things naturally tend toward what they ought to be and do. They don't always get there. Things can interfere, things can interrupt. There may be an exceptional one that is defective in some way. Nevertheless, day flows from the Tao. And so the idea is things naturally tend to be what they ought to be, to do what they ought to do. Now that tells us something extremely important about human affairs, about what we should do, both individually and also together. Things naturally work out, which means if things naturally tend to their own states of excellence, what should we do about it? Let them do it. Okay, just step back. Let things proceed the way they normally do. Don't interfere. Typically, things are going to work out. They're going to become what they ought to be and do, and so don't interfere. It'll all be okay. Go with the flow is one way of putting the basic moral premise of Taoism. Things are going to work out, and so leave it alone. Our activity is likely to do more harm than good. Now, it won't always do harm. The farmer may know how to actually graft things onto the apple trees to produce better apples, may know how to fertilize the trees to produce better apples, may know how to water the tree at the right time, and so forth, how to prune the tree. And so there are things we can do. But most things that someone without at least a great deal of skill and knowledge of this can do is bad. And so if you or I, without knowing much about apple trees, go in and start messing around with the orchard, we're likely to screw it up. If you don't know what you're doing, better not to do anything at all. So, inactivity is a virtue in Taoism. This is called Wu Wei. Wu Wei is a virtue. Inactivity is a virtue. Passivity, letting things take their course, going with the flow. The virtuous person here is one who doesn't interfere, doesn't go in and try to shape things. It's a very different model from Confucius. The Confucian is one who is constantly shaping, crafting, both the things around him and himself. But the Taoist lets things be. And that means doesn't really try to shape people, doesn't really try to shape him or herself. The Taoist is one who says, look, I'm naturally going to be what I'm supposed to be. So just relax. Just act spontaneously. Don't worry about it. Don't try so hard. So here are other Taoist virtues. Simplicity. The Taoist is simple. Doesn't worry about the huge complexity of existence. Doesn't, like the Buddhists, say, I've got to strain like an ox every moment pushing toward virtue. No, let it go. You have natural desires, yes, but you also have natural tendencies to limit those desires, to sometimes act on them and sometimes not. Trust yourself. The Confucian or the Buddhist is somebody who says, if I'm going to be healthy, I better observe a strict diet. I better start counting calories. I better get an app on my phone that counts calories. I know some people who are like this. Can't eat anything without plugging it in, finding out how many grams of fat or carbohydrates or whatever is going on. The Taoist says, look, you know what happens? You know what will tell you when you need to eat? You'll get hungry. You know what will tell you when to stop eating? You'll feel full. So just eat when you feel like eating. And there will be things you feel like eating. Eat them. Your body is telling you what to eat. If there are other things you don't want to eat, don't know. Okay? Now, that's the ordinary thing. Just eat what you want to eat when you want to eat. You'll be fine. It could be that you're a person for whom this is an exception. Well, if so, something's interfering with the natural process. So it's important to figure out what that is. It's not as if it's on, you might think, look, the fact that some people are obese refutes Taoism. But the Taoist will say, no, I'm saying normally, people don't have to worry about it. There can be exceptional cases. Yeah?
So would the Taoist see Plato's weakness of will as a virtue?
Weakness of will. Yeah, good question. Is that something that itself is a virtue? Sorry, my nose is itching, but also I watched this video this morning by Slavoj Žižek, a Czech philosopher, and he's constantly rubbing his nose. And I think somehow this has gotten in my head, and so now I'm rubbing my nose, imitating Žižek in these videos. Anyway. Okay. All right, enough of my Žižek impersonation. Although I have to keep then doing this, too. Anyhow, is weakness of will a virtue? Not exactly. Spontaneity is a virtue. And so here's the idea. The response to temptation is to act spontaneously. What is your natural impulse? Sometimes it will be to actually give in to temptation. Sometimes your natural impulse will be to resist. Trust your natural instincts. Okay? So sometimes you're going to see, here I'll mention one of my great temptations. One of those things that actually I'm fairly powerless to resist. Normally I'm a person with strong will. I don't get tempted by much. But peanut M&Ms are my undoing. Okay, I try not to have them around because I cannot resist them. But it's just after Halloween. So what does my wife do? She gets peanut M&Ms so that I will have peanut M&Ms, and I do love them, but they're like bad for me. Especially when you just open a bag and just sort of eat them all in one night, which is what I tend to do. But anyway, here's the thought. Trust your own instincts about this. Okay, you see the temptation, and if your instinct is, your spontaneous reaction is to grab those peanut M&Ms, well, go ahead and do it. It's all right. But after a few of them, and in my case, quite a few of them, you'll find yourself thinking, oh, man, I've eaten a lot of these. I don't want to eat it anymore. Good. Trust that instinct, okay? Sometimes, after especially doing that, you'll see them and you'll think, yeah, I'm not opening that bag. I'm not going to do them. In short, the Taoist is going to say, you've got a natural response to regulate weakness of will, to deal with temptation. Trust your natural instincts. Now again, things can go wrong. There are people who are so weak-willed that they're going to give in to the temptation of food, or sex, or laziness, or whatever it is too much. And there will be other people, maybe, who are too insensible and won't give in enough. But rather than saying, what's my view here? What exactly should I do? The Tao says, just trust your own instincts. If you've overindulged, your body, your mind will start telling you, I'm overindulging, cut it out. But if you haven't had any M&Ms in a long time and you think, oh man, they look great, then it's okay. So in short, the Taoist is going to say, we have evolved. I mean, the Taoist doesn't necessarily commit to evolution, but there's a nice evolutionary story to go along with this. We have evolved to have responses to temptation. Some of those involve at times giving in, some involve resisting. Trust your own natural response. I saw a question over here. Yeah.
So I'm getting like that perception that I want to say I'm not getting wise. Like, why should we listen to say like and the brain goes, maybe I'm over why should we listen to that instead of listen to our natural cases, which is what they're putting forth, like, okay, maybe you should listen to what's natural.
Good.
And so why, basically, how is this an argument?
Yeah. All right, good. Well, I've been training you in this course to think about arguments. And you might say, well, I'm hearing a view here, but I'm not hearing many arguments. And so what's the argument for this view? The underlying argument, in a way, is this idea that things naturally tend toward what they're supposed to be and do because day is determined by the Tao. And so you might say, although the Tao treats us like straw dogs and has no real moral component, on the other hand, we are manifestations of the Tao just like everything else. So we are going to naturally tend to do what we're supposed to do. And will we always do that? Well, no, we're not always, but we tend toward excellence. And so people, if left alone, tend toward excellence is the idea. So it's fine to be spontaneous. It's fine to be passive. It's fine to be tranquil, to be even weak, because in the end, it's not a question of strength. It's a question of letting yourself become what you're supposed to be. Now, in some respects, I think a lot of people feel some sympathy with this. Others will say, wait a minute, there are places where this doesn't make much sense. For example, well, actually, there is a real issue in elementary education about this. Take a bunch of kindergartners, and one group will say, we got to start teaching them their letters, teaching them to read, teaching them numbers, and so on. The other group will say, oh, no, let the true nature of the child come out. We'll just have PlayStation. And over here's some playground. Here are some blocks. Here is a place where the children can play with numbers, and they'll just do what they naturally do. Okay? Now, I'm slightly mocking this sort of Montessori idea as I go through this, but actually, I mean, there are Montessori schools. There are lots of people in education who think, look, that should be the basic paradigm. Start with the assumption that the child will learn what they're supposed to learn, and only at certain points intervene when you feel that something has to be done. Others are going to say, no, it's a question of making the children sit in line, stand in line, wait their turn, be silent, listen, etc. And that's a very different, more Confucian model. I think most of us intuitively are somewhere in between, thinking, look, I don't really want a Confucian, sort of a cross between a Confucian and a German lieutenant to be the kindergarten teacher. But neither do I want it to be a hippie sort of person who just says, just do whatever you want. I want to go play in the street. Okay. Somewhere in between those extremes is the right place. But where is it? The Taoist is saying it's much more in the direction of letting things go and only occasionally intervening. Well, what this means is we should typically act without acting, manage affairs without trouble, taste without tasting, consider the small great, the few many, and notice, repay injury with day. In Confucius, we repay injury with what? Justice, yes. It's not eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. It is instead repaying injury with justice. Here, repay it with virtue. Repay it with, well, spontaneous action. So the person comes up to you and suddenly punches you. What should you do? The Old Testament answer is punch him back. Jesus' answer is offer the other cheek. Confucius' answer is basically call the police. What is the Taoist answer? Whatever comes natural. Okay? So in short, your mind, your body are going to tell you what to do. Is your first response to run away? Is it to fight back? Is it call for help? Trust your instinct. Your instinct will tell you what to do. Now, what does this mean for Taoist leadership? How do you become a Taoist and actually lead? Are you supposed to do anything? Here's the answer. Plan difficult things while they're easy. Accomplish great things while they're small. Difficult things in the world start easy. Great things start small. Because the sage never does great things, he can accomplish great things. So in short, here's the model of Taoist leadership. Have you ever seen one of those games where there's a little ball and you have to steer the ball through to the goal without it falling into a hole by subtly tilting the playing field like this? That's what Taoist leadership is. The Taoist leader is one who just slightly tips things so that people naturally go in the direction they ought to go in. It's not a question of forcing people, having rules, having policies, procedures. It's a question of slight tilts in the playing field. So that difficult things are accomplished while they're easy. So, take easy things to be difficult because that way they won't be difficult. So, the thought here is being good requires no special effort. We don't need training. We naturally tend to be good. Virtue, righteousness, propriety, all of those are signs that something's gone wrong. We have to resort to dealing with virtue, to having rules of propriety, to dealing with questions of righteousness and what right action is and so on when something's already wrong. But if things are proceeding right, we don't need rules, we don't need principles, we don't need procedures, we don't need theories of right reason. Just act naturally, it'll be okay. So as soon as we need these Confucian things, and sometimes we do, that's already a sign of trouble. Okay, let me jump ahead to politics. What does this mean about politics? It means the best leaders are ones the people don't even know that they're there. The next best they love and praise. The next best they fear, the worst they despise. When rulers lose faith in their people, people lose faith in their rulers. So the idea here is the best leader is the one who's simply tilting that playing field, not even doing anything very observable. Okay, the best leader, the best ruler is one who really appears to be not doing much of anything at all. If the ruler loses faith in the people, no longer thinks they're naturally going to tend to do what they ought to do, people are going to lose faith in the ruler. And that verse continues, words matter. Work done, things accomplished, the people say, we did these things ourselves. So the greatest leaders are not those actually who are held up as the great leaders who did great things. The greatest leaders are the ones where you look and you think, gee, I don't know what they did, but look at the country, it really prospered under their leadership. So the best leaders are the ones that seem not to be doing much of anything at all, but instead allow the people to accomplish things themselves.